Hello. So today we're going to talk about Britain's preparations for war, and we're going to think about the way that Britain as a country and as a military power, and as an economic power, and as a civilian power managed to organise its people, its army and its economy in order to be able to fight the Second World War. So we started off by looking at the kind of social and economic conditions in Britain, the way that Britain was divided and the way that unemployment was a significant problem. So now what we're going to go on to look to is the second part of this kind of opening section, which is, as it says, the extent to which Britain was fully prepared for war in 1939, planning, developments in the Army, Navy and Air Force, and civil defence and industrial capacity. So basically there are a large number of different aspects that we can look at. When I teach this, I like to break them up into 4 different headings, as it were. So the first one, the one that we're going to look at today, is alliances. So the extent to which Britain was able to kind of build alliances to oppose the Germans mainly. The second one is military and straightforward. It's the way or the extent to which Britain's armed forces, the Army, the Navy and the Air Force were ready to fight the Second World War. The third one is the economy, how effective Britain's economy was and how well it was set up for the war. And the fourth one is civil defence. And civil defence just means the extent to which a government is able to protect its own people. So how well prepared Britain was for the German bombing campaign and the threat of invasion and those sort of things. So the 4 headings: allies, military, economy and civil defence. And as I said, today we're going to look at alliances. Okay, so as I said before, it's always good to start off when we're doing a new topic to think about the sort of questions that the SQA are going to ask. So last year, or 2 years ago technically, there was a source question which asks us, how fully does source A explain the extent of Britain's military preparedness at the outbreak of war in September 1939? So I've mentioned a bit before when thinking about exam questions that sometimes the wording of the question limits what you can talk about. Now I've already said that there are 4 different aspects to the preparations for war: alliances, economic, military and civil defence. And if this question had been, how fully does source A explain the extent of Britain's preparedness at the outbreak of war, you could have talked about all 4. But because it says military preparedness, you can only talk about military preparedness. Now, as it turns out, there is a huge amount you can talk about because the Army, Navy and Air Force were to some extent prepared and to some extent not prepared, but that question is just about military. So if you started talking about the economy or civil defence, you wouldn't get marks for it. This question is an essay question, so 2017, as I said, blue is source questions, red are essay questions. In 1939, Britain's civil defence was better prepared for war than our armed forces. How valid is this view? This is a comparison question where you would talk about military preparedness and civil defence, and you would come to a decision about which one was better. So you couldn't talk about economy or alliances really here, but you can talk about those 2 aspects. And 2014, how well prepared were the British government and its people when war broke out in 1939? That one means you could talk about everything. So that's a kind of conclusion question, basically, where you have to explain the main aspects and then come to an overall conclusion. So you would talk a bit about alliances, a bit about economy, a bit about civil defence, a bit about military, and then come to a conclusion and say, well, they were a bit prepared, but they were also a bit not prepared. So that's the sort of thing that we'll be doing. Preparedness for war questions are relatively straightforward. The historiography is quite easy to remember, and the way that you can structure an essay is quite straightforward. So this is one of the areas that I think is quite good to have a really good familiarity with, because it is quite easy to understand and it's quite easy to remember, and it also acts as a really good kind of basis for understanding and writing about things that happen later on, things that happen during the war. Now, the big problem with advanced higher and essay writing is that in order to properly answer those two essay questions, you have to have an understanding of what happened during the war. So to be able to say how prepared were they for war, you'd have to be able to understand what happened during the war and say, well, the Navy was prepared in this sense because of this battle, but not in this sense because of this battle. So what you're going to get now is a kind of basic ground, and it's kind of half the story. And then as we move forward and we begin to learn a bit more, and we study the war to a greater extent, you'll get a lot more that you can put into an essay about this. So it's a constant kind of building that you're constantly adding little structures here and there and creating a more and more sophisticated and a more complex answer. So that's why this bit can be quite difficult. And that's why as well that I won't actually teach you how to write essays until quite a bit later on, because if you try to write one of these essays now, even if after teaching you all the preparation for war stuff, you won't really be able to answer it effectively because you won't be able to give it its full context. Okay, so thinking about alliances today. So this is a map of Europe in 1939, and you can see that this is the map of Europe just prior to the war, and we can see that it's just prior to the war breaking out because there are a few kind of geographical anomalies. First one is that Czechoslovakia has disappeared. It's now been subsumed into Germany, so you can see that Bohemia, Moravia and Slovakia are now part of Greater Germany. You can also see that Austria doesn't exist anymore. It is also part of Germany. And so this is the situation that Britain faced at the outbreak of war. Now, when war broke out, Britain was able to count on the alliance of two countries, France and Poland. France and Britain were obviously able to form quite an effective alliance and oppose the Germans from the west. Poland going to oppose them from the east. Britain went to war ostensibly with the aim of protecting Poland, but as you'll see, in order to get to Poland, Britain and France would have to travel through Germany. So there's not all that much that Britain and France could do in order to help Poland, even though they declared war to protect her. And this is one of the kind of strange ironies of Chamberlain's leadership, that if he had opposed Germany a bit earlier when they were wanting to attack Czechoslovakia, things could have been quite different because the Czechoslovak army was advanced and well trained and had a lot of divisions that they were able to field. And so a unified attack from the Czechs, the Poles, the French and the British all at once probably would have overwhelmed the Germans. As it was, Germany was able to take on Czechoslovakia and take her territory basically without any struggle, and then was able to destroy Poland with the help of Russia, while Britain and France kind of watched on helplessly. So we can see that the geographical makeup of Europe is quite different in the 30s, in the late 30s, than it was in the early 30s, and obviously than it is today. You'll also notice at the bottom of the map, in the southern part of the map, that you can see that what is now Algeria and Morocco is part of France, and Libya is part of Italy. Well, not part. Libya is an Italian colony. French West Africa is a complex situation where the French like to consider it part of France, and the Algerians and the Moroccans didn't really necessarily feel that way. Okay. The various parts of Northern Europe Northern Africa did turn out to be quite an important battleground for the British and the Germans later in the war, and we'll look at that in a bit more depth. But it's just, all we have to know just now is that France and Italy control quite a lot of that, and Egypt is mainly controlled by Britain, as are some bits of what is now Israel. Oh, so the alliance system itself is quite a complicated one, And in order to kind of fully understand it, we have to look back at the context that happened from the end of World War I up until the start of World War II. And this is a picture of Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin during the war, which are the big three, the kind of main alliances. So during the war, there was a strong system of alliances, but that is very much not the case when war broke out. So most politicians and military leaders in Britain were very aware of the fact that in order to effectively oppose Germany during World War I, they needed the French and the Americans and the Russians to some extent in order to win. And so Britain, to some extent, had a policy of trying to make sure that if she was going to fight, she wouldn't have to fight alone. And so there was a real focus on trying to build a system of alliances, because Britain is mainly a naval power, and so most of the actual land fighting, the army fighting, would be done by somebody else. And so Britain tried to form alliances in order to kind of farm out the task of actually fighting the Germans to somebody else. And so this was the kind of one of the big political problems of the 1930s. A lot of people looking back in this period say that it was a time of horrific incompetence. Basically, the British did a series of stupid things and made a series of catastrophic failures, and it ended up that when war came, it was just Britain and France versus Germany, when it could have been Britain, France, Russia, and possibly even Italy all fighting against Germany. But it must be remembered as well at this time that political certainties and any kind of chance to build a kind of strong alliance was very, very difficult at this time. That the world was very much, as I said, it was in flux. There was a huge amount of change, a huge amount of competing ideologies all going on, and it was very difficult to know who you could trust, especially if some people seemed to have very different aims to you. So, while it's very easy to criticise Chamberlain for his failures to build alliances, you also have to have some level of understanding as to why he ended up in the position that he did. So basically, when thinking about this, we have to ask ourselves, did Britain do as much as they could? Did Chamberlain turn out to be as ineffective a politician as he could have been? He obviously ended up at the start of the war with fewer allies than he would have liked, but was that inevitable? Was that the only real situation that could have come to pass? So in order to answer that question, I'm going to look at some of the main political players at that time. So first, Russia. Now, as we know, Russia had been an important ally of Britain during World War I, and they'd helped to fight against the Germans. However, towards the end of the 1920s, the 1910s and into the 1920s, Britain had supported the Whites in the Russian Civil War. So it was the Whites versus the Reds, and the Reds being the Communists. Britain sided with the Whites and sent them troops and sent them guns. And so many people in Russia remembered that and were not particularly well disposed towards the British. A lot of British politicians also felt that the Russians wanted to spread communism to everyone in Europe, and as it turned out, this wasn't that unreasonable a belief, that a lot of people in Russia did want to spread communism to all the other countries of Europe, and their involvement in the Spanish Civil War seemed to give some credence to this belief. And so the British hierarchy, the British kind of government, were very opposed to communism, and so were very reluctant to join with the Russians. There's also a lot of people that thought that the Russians weren't very useful at fighting, that the Russian army was very ineffective. Stalin had spent a lot of time in the 30s purging. That basically means finding and killing a lot of the Russian generals, and so the Russian general staff was not a very effective organisation. The Russian leadership wasn't very good, and Russia fought a war with Finland the end of the 1930s, and the Finns, even though they were a small country with a not very large army, had managed to inflict quite a serious number of defeats on the Russians. The Russians eventually won, but they won at quite a big cost. So a lot of people looked at that and thought, well, if Russia are going to struggle to beat the Finns, they're not really going to be much help against the Germans. The big problem in Europe is that a lot of countries, especially countries that border each other, really do not like each other. And possibly the best example of that is the animosity between Poland and Russia. So if Britain had managed to form an alliance with Russia and Germany had invaded Poland, it is very unlikely that the Poles would have consented to having Russian support. So as it turns out, when Germany declares war on Poland, Russia joins in and declares war on Poland, and the Germans and the Russians end up splitting Poland in half. And for a lot of people, this is a clear indication that the Russians couldn't be trusted. As it says there as well, there's no connecting border between Germany and Russia. So even if Russia had agreed to fight Germany, there's not really much they could have done at the start of the war. There's not really many ways that they could have helped, and so having them as an ally for a lot of people wasn't seen as all that much of a priority. And Chamberlain himself did not like the Russians, and this is probably the main reason why Britain does not form an alliance with Russia. The leader of Britain looked down on Russia, and he looked down on the Russian military. He says, a quote from this period, "I must confess the most profound distrust of Russia. I have no belief whatsoever in her ability to maintain an effective offensive, even if she wanted to, and I distrust her motives, which seem to me have little connection with ideas of liberty." But basically, Chamberlain thinks that the Russians are not very good at fighting, and he thinks that they have no real interest in British values. So for those two reasons, he doesn't put much effort into trying to build an alliance with them. Churchill has a slightly different view. Churchill wasn't that powerful in the 30s. He was a kind of outsider looking in. He was influential in the sense that a lot of people kind of saw him as a man of vision, but he had no real power to back his vision up. But he did quite strongly argued for an alliance with Russia on one or two occasions. And looking back in this, Churchill says, if Chamberlain had replied, it's a reply to Stalin, "Yes, let us three band together and break Hitler's neck," the three being Russia, France and Britain, or words to that effect, Parliament would have approved, Stalin would have understood, and history might have taken a different course. At least it could not have taken a worse. Basically what Churchill is saying is that if Chamberlain had gone to see Stalin and said to Stalin, look, if you, me, and France all stand up against Germany, there's no way that Germany will continue to be a threat, because they'll be too frightened, because they know that a united front of France, Britain and Russia would be able to easily defeat them in a war. And so if he'd done that earlier on in 1937 or so, 1938, then the advantage that Hitler took of the kind of political situation might not have happened, and war might never have come. But again, it's difficult to look back and say, we can say anything for certain. You have to remember, as I said, at this time, a lot of people didn't think Russia were very effective, and they did not think that the Russians kind of had any real interest in preserving democracy or liberty or anything like that. So that is Russia. The next major power is, of course, the USA. So the USA came late into World War I, but most people are willing to admit that they did significantly contribute to the Allied victory, that with a mass influx of US troops was able to turn the tide of war. And so many British people thought that if we are going to end up fighting Germany, then we are going to need the Americans. And so an alliance with America was seen for some people as being the key foreign policy objective, the thing that Britain should try hardest to achieve. However, while a lot of people in Britain were very keen to see Britain and America join an alliance, most people in America did not feel the same way. That they looked on the First World War as a time when they'd gone to help solve one of Europe's problems. And they looked at World War I really as a European war that the Americans were eventually forced to get involved in very reluctantly. And most Americans in the 20s and 30s were very keen to make sure that that situation was not repeated. And so the policy of American presidents in the 20s and 30s was strongly isolationist. Basically, they wanted to focus on America and American policies. They didn't want to get involved in trouble in Europe, and they thought Europe was far enough away and separate enough from America that the Americans wouldn't have to play any role in it. Roosevelt even went as far as to campaign in the 1940 American presidential election to say that he would not get involved in a European war. He promised the voters that he wouldn't do that. And it's possible that he might not have got involved at all if it wasn't for the fact that Japan launched the Pearl Harbor attacks, thus declaring war on America, and then Hitler, in one of the worst decisions ever made by a military leader, decided to join in and also declared war on America. And if Germany hadn't done that, if they hadn't declared war on America, then it is possible that the Americans might not have got involved in the war in Europe at all. Chamberlain had a equally negative view of the Americans as he had of the Russians, and he famously said, "It is always safe to count on nothing from the Americans other than words." Basically, the Americans would quite often say that they were friends with Britain, but they wouldn't actually ever do anything about it. And the situation was not helped by the fact that John F. Kennedy's dad, who was called Joseph Kennedy, was the ambassador to Britain during this period, and he hated the British. He has sometimes been called a Nazi sympathiser. I don't know if I would go as far as to call him a Nazi sympathiser, but he certainly was vehemently anti-British, and so he would constantly write letters or diplomatic dispatches to Roosevelt, basically saying that Britain was a rubbish country, their military was dreadful, and if it ever came to a war, the Germans would crush them. So there was this kind of mutual bad feeling between the Americans and the British in this period. And Roosevelt was very clear that he could see that Chamberlain didn't like him. He famously said, "We must recognise that he, as Chamberlain, thoroughly dislikes Americans. This is a bit of a problem. If the leader of your country, a country that needs an alliance with America, clearly has a problem with Americans, then you're going to have a big problem." So Chamberlain did not do well in terms of bringing the Americans into a grand alliance. There was no significant attempts made by him to try and bind the Americans into some kind of anti-Nazi league. However, even with the best British Prime Minister, the most perfect British Prime Minister you could envisage, it would almost have been impossible to bring the Americans into an alliance. That the Americans in this period just had no interest in a war in Europe, and there probably wasn't anything that anyone could have done to convince them. So while we can criticise Chamberlain rightly for his negative attitude towards the Americans, even if he had been very different, it's likely that the outcome wouldn't have changed, that he was still would have been a Prime Minister who had to kind of show the hand of friendship to America, but not really have anything given to him in return. So America not keen on allying with Britain. Russia possibly keen on allying with Britain, but the situation is made clear that the British aren't really that keen. So you've got two major powers, both with slightly different perspectives. And then we have the other often unmentioned area. Now, it's one of the great myths of World War II that Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany and the Italians in 1940, and that there's even books called A Nation Alone and things like that. And that is stupid and possibly offensive, because when Britain was facing Germany in 1940 after France had been knocked out of the war, they were not alone. They had all of these countries that are coloured in red helping them, which, as we can see, is quite a significant number of countries. This is, of course, the British Empire. Now, the British Empire was obviously allied to Britain. There were some countries that decided to declare war through their own choice. These were countries that had what we call dominion status. It basically meant that they were able to make almost all of their own decisions. These were countries that were dominated by white people. So you have the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders, and the South Africans. They were, because they had governments run by basically the descendants of white Europeans, they were seen as being trusted to make their own decisions. And so when Britain declared war on Germany, Australia, Canada, New Zealand quickly followed suit, and then South Africa followed suit a couple of days later through various circumstances that aren't really that important. But if you're very interested, you can go and read about the kind of situation that happened in South Africa at the outbreak of war. Now, the other countries of the empire, that is most of kind of North and East Africa, along with the Indian subcontinent, they weren't trusted with their own government, and so Britain very nicely decided to declare war on their behalf. So all of these countries were joined Britain in declaring war on Germany. And so when we were opposing the Germans, supposedly alone, we actually had around a third of the world's surface joining with us in opposing the Germans. So the empire is something that has to be remembered, and positive relations with the dominions, that is Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, are very important because they chose to help Britain, and Canada and Australia and New Zealand in particular were able to provide a huge amount of support to Britain during the war, both in terms of money, materials and men. And South Africans provided a lot of that too, but to a slightly different extent due to the kind of social and economic situation of South Africa itself. The other countries of the empire provided a huge number of troops. There are a large number of Africans serving in the British Army, and literally millions of Indians who fought against the Japanese in Asia. So when we're thinking about these things, we are mainly thinking about the alliances with, when we talk about alliances, we're thinking about France and Russia and America, but you've got to remember that the empire are an unbelievably important resource for Britain as well. So, the British troops, the Imperial troops had been very important during World War I. Anzacs and the Canadians and the Indians and African Rifles had all been very important in a lot of World War I battles. As I said, the Dominions, Australia, New Zealand, Canada and South Africa had their own foreign policies, and so they were able to declare war themselves, whereas the other countries were forced to do it without them. British were very mindful of the fact that, if we go back to the map, we can't. If you link back to the map, that Britain's main threat at this time is Germany. Australia and New Zealand main threat, or main fear, main worry at this time is the threat of the Japanese. And so while the empire is a great benefit to Britain, it also stretches Britain's resources, because, well, other countries like Germany would only really have to fight in Europe if it came to a war. Germany was fighting Britain, and then the Japanese joined in on the German side, which a lot of people viewed as being very possible. then the British would have to defend her own country and the empire. So India, Australia and New Zealand, and this put a huge strain on Britain. Even though Britain did have a very significant navy, they didn't have a large enough navy to be able to project power in two areas. And so British policy in the 30s is quite a lot focused on kind of calming the worries of Australia and New Zealand and saying, you know, if things get bad, we will send materials and men down to protect and preserve your independence. So that is another very important aspect of British considerations in this period. Okay, as I said, the kind of final thing is historiography. So what do the historians think about this? Now, as I've said, there's not really that much debate about the Americans. Now, you can criticise Chamberlain for his attitude towards the Americans, but as I've said, even with a better attitude, he probably couldn't have done anything. So the main area of criticism isn't to do with America, it's to do with Russia. So a lot of people are very willing to criticise Chamberlain's attitude to Russia. So that's where I focus most of the historiography for today. So, excuse me. So Chamberlain, Montgomery Hyde, who's a historian, says Chamberlain, who had visited Hitler 3 times, brushed aside suggestions that he should make personal contact with Stalin. So Chamberlain was willing to go and meet Hitler. In fact, met him on more than one occasion. He was not willing to go and meet Stalin. And that maybe tells you something about Chamberlain as a person. Very famous Tory politician R.A. Butler, who is famous for the Butler Education Act, amongst other things, wrote quite a famous book after the war, which kind of discussed his whole career, and a lot of the things he says about the war are quite interesting. And one of the things he says, both on political and military grounds, the USSR could not be trusted to wage war in defence of interests that were not bound up with their own security. So he's basically defending Chamberlain there, and he's saying, look, in this period, in the 30s, we just couldn't trust Russia. So we couldn't join in an alliance with them because they were just untrustworthy. And then A.G.P. Taylor, who, as I maybe mentioned before, one of my favourite historians and possibly the best British historian of the 20th century and arguably the best British historian of all time, suggests that it is certain that he, that is Chamberlain, abhorred alliance with Soviet Russia against Germany. Basically, Chamberlain was greatly opposed to joining with the Russians, and he goes on to say, it's a reasonable surmise, that's a reasonable conclusion, that most English people came to regard communist Russia as less wicked than Nazi Germany only late in the day, perhaps not until Hitler's attack on Russia. So, in the kind of mid to late 30s, people could maybe see that Hitler was bad, but a lot of people thought that Stalin was equally bad, and that there was a lot of evidence that Stalin had killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions of people. And so there would be real criticism of Chamberlain if he'd tried to form an alliance with the Russians, considering the kind of person that Stalin was. So these are the kind of factors we need to balance together when deciding whether Britain did a good job or not. And as I've said repeatedly, and will continue to tell you repeatedly, this is a decision you have to make for yourself. Did Chamberlain do the right thing? Could he have done anything else? Would a reasonable politician not have acted in exactly the same way? And that is the kind of question you have to ask yourself. Using the evidence that we have here and some of the other evidence from primary sources and things like that, that's something that you'll have to make up your mind for. So the first part of our preparations for war is alliances, and we have to decide, you know, how prepared was Britain in terms of alliances. And we can say, well, they didn't have an alliance with Russia and they didn't have an alliance with America, but they couldn't really have had an alliance with America, and they shouldn't really have had an alliance with Russia. Or you could argue that they should have had an alliance with Russia. So it's about trying to decide which one of these is true, which one you can argue for, which one the evidence is there for. And that is the kind of key aspect of advanced hire, is making your mind up for yourself.